Ready.
Okay. I'm just checking.
Yep.
All right. Welcome to Talk with History. I'm your host, Scott, here with my wife and historian, Jen.
Hello.
On this podcast, we give you insights to our history-inspired world travels, YouTube channel journey, and examine history through deeper conversations with the curious, the explorers, and the history lovers out there. Now, before we get into our main topic tonight, I do want to ask for reviews on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you're listening. The reviews really do help the show grow, and we are still slowly plodding away at chipping away at that lead with the History Channel.
We're coming after you.
I'm not aware of podcasts that they put on, so maybe we're ahead of them on the podcast front.
Yes.
I'm just going to kind of
We're going to have more
throw that out.
subscribers in the History Channel someday.
We will. One day. It's coming. Lots of stuff coming. All right. So, Jen, why don't you tell us what we're talking about today? One of our videos that we just released.
Yeah, this video and this podcast is a very important place and moment in time for any history lover, any adventurer, any explorer, because we go to a place that's a bucket list historical location.
And you lead off the video, right off with that. Hey, bucket list place for any history fan or historian. So where were we?
We were at Appomattox Court House in Virginia.
We were at Appomattox Court House. So if you don't know, or if you're just joining us for the first time, we just live a couple hours away from there. We live in Virginia, and so we had to get out to Appomattox.
Yes,
and we actually learned a fair amount while we were there. Like you kind of done some research before we got out there, but one of the things that a lot of people didn't know was kind of the whole naming convention. We kind of led off with that.
Yes, because it's always a confusing thing for any historian when they talk about the surrender of the Civil War. And we'll go into some of the feedback we've gotten from people. Yeah. This is the official surrender of the Civil War. This is where Lee and Grant will meet. So you got the commander of the Confederate forces and the commander of the Union forces are going to meet and actually work out terms of surrender. There are other people, historians, who will surmise other moments and battles that were the actual surrendering point, or when tides were turned towards surrender. But this is the actual moment where they're going to meet officially and write up terms of surrender. And so I want to make that very clear.
Yeah, we did, and it's common with all of our videos, especially the more popular ones, that people always kind of jump in. And we had some folks kind of teach us, some interesting facts on different videos, like, the naming convention behind Bull Run and Manassas and things like that.
Yes.
But for Appomattox specifically, we had a few folks jumping in and saying, hey, this wasn't the actual end. Like, there was troops over here fighting like a few weeks later.
And that's true because, communication isn't traveling quickly.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like it's a phone call. Okay, war's over. It doesn't work that way.
It's the 1860s. It takes weeks for word to get anywhere to do anything.
Exactly. So, yeah, there were people still fighting. Absolutely. But this is the official surrender. What was also interesting is if you're a moderate historian, the surrender happened in Appomattox Court House, and it sounds like a location.
Right, a building.
And it is a building, but it's also the name of the town. And the surrender doesn't take place in the actual courthouse building of Appomattox. It takes place in the McLean House, which is located in the town of Appomattox Courthouse.
Yeah, and we actually we had made a short kind of about that, but the Appomattox Courthouse, the actual building, the courthouse, that's where the visitor center is.
Yes, and that has a great visitor center.
It's very good.
It's very good. A lot of information. They have a great movie there, and I think famous actors are in that movie, and it sets the tone for where you're at and the build up and what happened that day in April in 1865. So it's very good to get in there and watch that movie. Plus they have some artifacts in there. They have the actual surrender table in there. So you definitely want to visit the actual Appomattox Courthouse in Appomattox Courthouse because it is the visitor center.
Yeah, so it wasn't the Appomattox, the actual building, the courthouse building where the surrender took place, But again, that visitor center and some of the other things there, like they actually probably have one of the best depictions of what it actually looked like inside of the McLean house when they were sitting down and actually, signing the paperwork.
Yes.
Because they pointed out, one of the things that I like that they pointed out, they said, hey, this painting over here is very famous, and a lot of people misconstrue that as what actually happened. And it's the painting of Grant and Lee where they're almost like sitting right at the same table, right next to each other in the center of the room. And that's actually historically inaccurate.
It's inaccurate. And also you have George Custer there, who he wasn't there in the room. George Custer is pinnacle to the whole surrender in general, because he's the first person to actually get the surrender flag or dish towel they use for the surrender. But he's not in the room when the official surrender documents are written out and signed. He's outside with his men. So they have him there, I think, is to pay homage to him in his part in the surrender, but he wasn't in the room.
Yeah. So from there, we were in the actual courthouse itself, which was a visitor center. So we were chit-chatting and this, that, and the other. And all of a sudden, when we were there, we hear this announcement. The McLean house, if you want to see the McLean house, it will be closing in like 10 minutes.
10 minutes.
15 minutes. You have 15 minutes and it's closing for the next 90 minutes. And we're like, oh my gosh, what's going on? We had just gotten there.
So we
ran
kind
of made our way up, and we didn't want to have to wait to go to the one building that we actually went to go see for 90 minutes because they were, the people there were working. They
taking
a lunch break.
So we've talked about Wilbur McLean before.
Right.
We've talked about him on two separate occasions with Walk with History. We have visited his grave in the Alexandria Cemetery, and we had visited kind of the area where his home was in the first battle of Bull Run, the first battle of the Civil War. He is also a historic character of the Civil War because Wilbur McLean can't seem to get away from the Civil War.
Right.
Because his home is destroyed, he lives in the city of Manassas during the first battle of the Civil War. He wants to move away from the fighting, so he moves to the town of Clover Hill, which becomes the town of Appomattox Court House. And when the surrender takes place, Marshall, who is Lee's second right-hand man, aide, has to find a suitable place for surrender. And he finds the Wilbur McLean house in Appomattox Court House. And the surrender takes place in the parlor. So Wilbur McLean cannot get away from the Civil War. It begins and ends where he lives.
And it's funny. I've mentioned it a couple times throughout this podcast and videos and things like that. I love the random little historic characters that just pop up and are well known for some one random thing. And Wilbur McLean is one of those. And so that just kind of made me smile because now we've kind of visited where the Civil War started, where the Civil War ended, and where Wilbur McLean, who was at both of those locations for both times, where he's actually buried.
Where he's buried. Exactly. It's interesting that the town is called Appomattox Court House, and we talk a little bit about that in the video. Clover Hill, that town, it's about 100 people, and it's a farming community. So half the people are enslaved because when you have farming in the South, your laborers are enslaved. So half of the town is enslaved. It is along the Lynchburg stagecoach line, and they decided to build a courthouse there for governing. So people in the county can come and do their judicial business. When a courthouse is established, they start to call that area where the courthouse is along the stage line, they name it after the courthouse. So even though it's the town of Clover Hill and you will hear Clover Hill Tavern, and that is the location where they print all the pardon slips after the surrender, it officially becomes the town of Appomattox Courthouse after the courthouse is established there. And that is why when people say the surrender happened in Appomattox Courthouse, you're like, yes, the town of Appomattox Courthouse. Wilbur McLean's house, which isn't very far from Appomattox Courthouse. So when they said you have 90 minutes, you can just go out the front door and it's like a straight shot.
Yeah, it's maybe 30 yards.
And it's right there to the left. Now, what's interesting about that home, it's built in 1848. It has a tavern type style to it if you've been to other colonial tavern type homes. But it was in the 1890s, it was completely taken apart. And they had financiers who had come in and wanted to move it. And they were going to move it to Washington, D.C., and make it a museum so people could go in and visit and see where the official surrender of the Civil War took place. So they took it apart. They took plans of it all, and it sat there, and the financing fell through to actually move it. So it sat as bricks and wood for about 50 years, and people would come and take souvenirs and take a brick here, take a piece of wood here. And the National Park Service bought it in 1939 and rebuilt it to the specifications that they had. But the World War II breaks out, so they don't have the financing right away. So it takes about 10 years to rebuild it. It opens to the public in 1949.
That's right.
But it is in the same location. It is built to the specifications. They have gotten furniture in there to replicate what it looked like, because we will talk about this. The actual furniture is in other locations. But you get the sense of what that looked like that day, what Lee felt, what Grant felt as they're walking up the steps, and the people and the surrounding area. So it is still very historically relevant. And they did use the same materials that were left behind. So it is a very historic place to visit.
Yeah, and the house itself, I mean, even for the time, it must have been pretty big, because it's a decent-sized house even by today's standards.
When you think of a tavern
yeah.
having to entertain and feed people who come to visit, it does have that kind of feel to it.
So it makes sense that that's where they would pick, because it had the space, right? Even the room, as you kind of joke, the room where it happened. You go in there, and it's a decent sized room. You could see there was probably 10-ish men in there or something like that.
Yeah, about 12 men.
And so it's a decent sized house, very picturesque, right? With the courthouse on one end, and then the parking lot where we drove up and parked on the other, and then there's the McLean house, and there's other little, the timing when we went, what was that? April, early May.
The end of April. So I bet it's very busy the beginning of April, since that's the time frame of when the surrender takes place, April 9th, 1865. But we got there the end of April, which was perfect weather and not very crowded.
It was gorgeous. If you're ever going to go visit, that the springtime is fantastic, because everything was green, everything was in bloom. Some of the bugs were out a little bit for us that day, but it wasn't too bad. Not a lot of, it wasn't very crowded, and they have tons and tons of signs and historic markers. You can literally just kind of meander around this small town. I mean, now a national park, and just kind of read everything all along the way.
There's actually a hike you can do, because Lee's headquarters and Grant's headquarters are pretty spaced opposite each other in the area, and you can actually hike from one to the other, and it kind of goes through the town of Appomattox Court House, and you see people out there hiking and walking and things like that. And we visited other locations close by. We'll talk about the Confederate cemetery we saw and other kind of markers we saw, but it is a really great location if you want to spend the day. They have picnic tables, and if you want to spend the day with your family, it's a really great place to kind of walk around. It kind of reminds me of Foot's Battle Bull Run a little bit, maybe a very, very, very smaller scale Gettysburg type thing.
Sure.
But it's not really a drivable trail like Yorktown or Gettysburg. It's much more of a walking, but it is pretty much like a day trip.
Yeah, and I loved being out on the front steps of the McLean house, because you really could, and you do a good job of kind of describing, imagine, being here, and Lee, comes up to the McLean house in his nice, clean uniform, pressed, all this stuff. He gets there first. He's hanging out for 30 minutes or so. And then up comes Grant, just dirty. He'd been riding. Mud. You can barely tell he's a general other than by the jacket that he's wearing. And you can picture both in this setting. It's one of those locations. It's really, really neat, and you can kind of really feel what must have been like back then.
Yeah.
And I also imagine back then, because you go on to talk about how there was 90,000 troops in the area.
90,000 troops. So you think about 70,000 Union troops, about 30,000 Confederates, and they're camping out. I mean, they're not staying in the homes there. They're in their makeshift tents. So when you look at all the greenery in the area, you can imagine these troops are camped out everywhere. So it's very much a busy hustle and bustle, and everyone's kind of watching for what's happening in this house. So, and so what leads up to this? You're going to get Richmond Falls on April 3rd, and Lee is leaving Richmond. Richmond has fallen to the north, and he's trying to make it west. And he's trying to make it west to meet up with the armies of North Carolina and Tennessee. And so the Union is trying to cut him off before he gets there. So if you think of Appomattox as kind of west to Richmond, Appomattox, as I said, is on the stage line. It's also on the railroad line. And so Custer gets out there first on April 7th, and he's able to stop these railroad cars that are bringing supplies to the south, and he burns them. And that's when Lee starts to realize that he's not going to be able to meet his men. They're trying to cut him off. And so Grant will send him a note on the 7th saying, would you like to surrender? And Lee is like, not yet, but what would that look like? It's like, not yet, but what do you have in mind? So they're kind of negotiating this. Lee still thinks maybe there's something that he can do. Maybe he can make it in time. But Custer and Sherman will actually completely cut off the army at Appomattox, and there's no way that they can rejoin. And so they do fight a little bit. You get some fighting on the 8th and 9th, but it's Lee who decides, even though he says he'd rather die 1,000 deaths, it's Lee who decides to send the word to Grant. They bring out, they have the dish towel they give to Custer, because that's who the actual fighting forces, Longstreet and Custer, will meet. Custer will stop fighting. He will go through the line with the towel, and they'll let's negotiate surrender. They'll get the note to Lee, ask Lee to find a location. They find the McLean house. Grant will have to ride 30 miles, which is crazy, to meet him. That's why he's so dirty. And Lee gets there at 1. Grant will get there at 1:30 on April 9th. Lee has been thinking about this. Of course, he looks very clean, very pressed in his uniform. Grant has also been thinking about this, but he's exhausted.
He's just hopping off his horse.
And mud covered. And when they meet, they're almost like in awe of each other. They both studied at West Point. They both are skilled men. Lee has been the commander of the Confederate forces for all 5 years. Grant has not, but Grant has proven himself as a fighter. And Grant stands so in awe of Lee, he doesn't even know what to talk about when he comes in.
Yeah, he's like trying to make chit-chat.
Chit-chats about their military experience in the Spanish-American War. Let's talk about the Mexican-American War. Let's talk about what we were doing then. And Lee's like, okay, let's talk about surrender.
Yeah.
So when they sit down to hash out terms of surrender, like I said, Lee will have one person with him. Marshall will be with him. Grant will have an entourage.
Yeah.
He has Sheridan. He has Robert Todd Lincoln is with him. He has Eli Parker, who is of the Seneca American Indian tribe, is with him. And Eli Parker is the one who's actually the scribe.
Yeah.
And the terms that Lee is asking for, I think, are pretty reasonable. And I think that's why Grant grants them to him. He asks, most of his men are farmers from the South, and they will be going back to their farms. And a lot of them own their own horses. And the horses will be very valuable and important to farming.
Sure.
Right? To putting in seeds and all the things that you need on a farm. And so he asks is if their men own a horse, can they take the horse with them? And Grant says that's fine. And he also says because they're farmers and because they're traveling, can they keep their sidearms? Again, a gun at the time is seen as a tool.
Sure.
It's seen, as hunting for food, all these kind of things that a gun provides. And Grant also agrees to that. And he asks that the Confederates sign with their pardon that they will never take up arms again against the Union, against America, and they can keep their horse and they can keep their sidearm. And that is the terms of surrender.
Yeah, and if I remember correctly, Lincoln was pretty adamant about, like the healing nature, right?
Mm-hmm.
And not being super harsh with these terms of surrender. Right, and not saying like, "Hey, no, I want these people imprisoned. I want execution." Like he wasn't going for that. He wanted to kind of just finish this all off. It sounded like he didn't want to like create martyrs. Like he But I think you even mentioned it in the video. He wanted to create that healing.
Yeah, he didn't want to try Davis for treason. He didn't want to try Lee for treason. There was not going to be some kind of big trial and execution. Like you said, he didn't want martyrs, and he also didn't want animosity from the South.
Yeah.
He wanted the South to, I mean, people have been fighting for 4 years. People have been dying. Lincoln had lost a child during this whole time, and everyone is just very exhausted, war weary. And he just wanted the South to go back and be welcomed back into the Union. I wouldn't say as effective citizens again, but it also is, you can't have this underground animosity building back up again. It has to be, you're back, you're our countrymen, you've paid your price. You've lost so many people. There have been entire towns where every able-bodied man of 18 to 60 had been killed. Your economy is decimated.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what happens to McLean. It's all his money's in the Confederacy. So after they do the surrender in his parlor and they take all his furniture,
all of a sudden he's broke.
He's broke.
Yeah.
So he can't even keep the house. He leaves, goes back to Alexandria. And so in a day, everything that all of these men have had and their families is worth nothing. And so Lincoln knows it's going to be a big rebuilding too, as well. So he feels like people have paid the price.
Yeah. And even, I think that was even recognized there, right? And it's been kind of, immortalized in different kind of reenactments and videos that we've seen out there. What is it? Gods and Generals is one of the...
Yeah, Gettysburg is the big one, but Gods and Generals and North and the South.
North and the South. But even that, so one of the things that they call out, both at the national park and when I was making the video a couple times in videos, and they mentioned that when they had finished signing the paperwork, the terms of surrender, Lee kind of, walks back outside. He gets on his horse, and Grant just kind of gives him this like kind of tip of the hat, like takes his hat off salute, like not an official military salute, but something to acknowledge that it's done, right, and to show that respect.
And to remember, all the Union soldiers start to celebrate.
That's right.
They start firing their guns in the air, and Grant gets mad.
Yeah.
Remember, right away,
he
has them stop, has them shush, has them be quiet, has them act respectful.
Yeah.
Because it really is a time of rebuilding.
Yeah.
It's a time of exhaustion when you think about it. And because, again, we talk about the lines of communication and what is happening now and how people travel. We've talked about passes to travel and people carrying paperwork with them. They go to print out these 30,000 pardons, right? We talk about almost 70,000 Union soldiers. We have 30,000 Confederate soldiers. Well, now that they've all surrendered, they need these passes of pardon to travel back to their homes because people are still fighting.
Yeah.
And so the Clover Tavern, which is close to the Appomattox Court House, they put in a printing press in the downstairs parlor, a big tavern, and they start printing out these 30,000 pardon passes so they can carry these passes with them.
Well, and that's also how they get the word out.
That's how they get the word out.
You mentioned that in the video, like word, there's no phones, there's no, nothing like that. And that's the way they get the word out is these people walking home with this piece of paper saying, yes, the South has essentially surrendered. And this is my pass to return home. And so that's another way that the word of the end of the Civil War finally got spread, was as these men were traveling home.
Yes. And so you get a very symbolic, the day after April 10th, you see Grant and Lee will meet one last time towards the I think it's the east end of Appomattox.
Something.
And they make a very symbolic show. All the men of the Confederacy will leave their rifles.
Right.
So they're allowed to keep their sidearms, but they leave their rifles, and they show this surrendering of their weapons. And it's in that moment that people are really separating, starting to travel back home, starting to go back to their lives. And that's also, people acted very respectful of both sides in that moment. Out on the other side of Appomattox Court House, there's a Confederate graveyard So
I think I missed that.
I put it. It's on Instagram.
Okay.
So on the 8th and 9th of April, there was still fighting, and there were soldiers who died in the vicinity of Appomattox Court House, and they basically buried them where they fell. But a year later, in 1866, these Southern women decided to dig up these graves and bury them all together, and they had found 18 Confederates and one Union soldier.
That's right. Yes.
And so they put them all in one graveyard. So when you look at my video on Instagram, there's 18 Confederate flags and one Union flag, one American flag in this graveyard because they decided to bury them all side by side. They were able to identify, I think, half of them. The other half are still unknown.
Yeah, and this was the place, and that's why I was confused at first. It's not actually in the little village city area. It's actually
along that walking trail.
It's probably like half a mile, maybe a mile down, maybe not even a mile. But it's, you drive in, you actually see it on the way in, and you can come swing by and stop at it on the way out. It's actually a fairly popular Instagram reel for some reason.
Yeah, I think because it's interesting to see Confederate flags on graves still, I think. And there's a marker there that we also bring attention to.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, I'm the one who brought it to your attention.
It's again, we talk about this lost cause and the Southern, and I want to talk a little bit about this because I think Appomattox Courthouse Visitor Center does a very good job of telling the story of why federal soldiers are fighting, why Southern soldiers are fighting, because you're going to get this still today, these two points of views, states' rights, enslavement. What are we fighting? What are people fighting for? What's the cause of the Civil War? And this marker talks about after the Southern soldiers fought bravely for 4 years for the rights of their country, Lee surrendered, and it really skews the numbers, like 9,000 men.
It's definitely old Southern leaning.
Yes,
for sure.
So, and then it looks like they've taken off the whole bottom line that talks about Grant and how many men Grant had. They just kind of like have stripped it.
Yeah, and it's not like it was weather worn because this is a metal sign. This was intentionally taken off.
Yeah, take it off.
You could still read it. It was
so
interesting.
That's interesting. I think it's important to keep those markers up.
Sure.
Because I think it's important to show how people even still wanted to protect the story and protect their ideals and what they were fighting for. And I think Appomattox does a good job. They talk about why federal soldiers fought. You got a lot of recent immigrants who joined the Union, and they want to stay. They come to America for a reason. All these immigrants are coming in the 1860s because American liberty and independence and prosperity. So they think if they fight for the Union, they're going to be able to preserve that, what they came for, right?
Okay.
They don't want to lose that.
Interesting.
And so the whole point of keeping America together is all of this commerce works together. All of this American trade and resources, they all work together. And immigrants who have come here to partake in that don't want to lose that. And then they have why Confederate soldiers fought. And they talk about a crucial motivator for many soldiers was defense of their homes and their families against Northern armies. And whether or not they owned enslaved, they did believe in still a hierarchy. There was still a hierarchy in their minds, even if they're not owning enslaved, that there was a supremacy based on race. So, but I think it's true that most Southern soldiers are not enslavers. They don't own enslaved.
Yeah, not all of them were that rich.
And they're fighting because their families are coming under attack. But we do know that enslavement is the cause of the Civil War because, and even though Lincoln, and they make a point to say this, he did not advocate for the what's that word? Abolition?
Yeah.
Abolition of slavery. Sorry, can't read that word now. So even though Lincoln did not advocate for that running as president, he never would have won.
Sure.
What is happening is he's advocating for the no spread of enslavement. So what's going on with the Missouri Compromise and Kansas is they want to spread enslavement to other states because it's a way to have free labor. It's a way for commerce to work. And Lincoln wants to stop that because it does hurt the economy when you can't pay laborers.
Sure.
And you get all these immigrants coming to America, and they are laborers.
Right.
And so that's what Lincoln is stopping, the spread of enslavement. And then you're going to have the southern states who write their constitutions putting enslavement as part of their cause. So it does become more so the cause of the Civil War. And then Lincoln will see the strength behind that,
Right.
and the strength behind the Emancipation Proclamation, and the strength behind enlisting black soldiers. And it really gets full momentum during the Civil War. And I think the Appomattox Court House does a very good job of telling that story, because it's an honest story.
Yeah, it's not leaning one way or the other.
It's not leaning one way or the other.
This is how it was.
And then people can really understand why you can still needle in those kind of beliefs that are still kind of fought against today.
Right.
You can still see where that comes from.
That's interesting, because I had probably heard it, right, again, but not being the person that latched on to history as I was going through my younger year education. I had never kind of considered that Lincoln would on the economic side of the slavery debate back then was, hey, I want these people coming to our country so that they can earn a living and help build this nation and this, that, and the other. And that wouldn't happen if slavery continued to spread, because that's essentially, enslavement is free labor, quote unquote. And so that, to your point, that is kind of counteracting, being able to grow a true workforce for people coming in. So I hadn't really considered that piece of it. And obviously that's one aspect of the entire debate.
Sure.
But that was probably the genesis of some of it from the economic
follow
side.
The money.
You follow the money. And then from there, people start digging in their heels and they're like, well, we're just going to write it into our state constitution that slavery is okay. And, this, that, and the other. So that's interesting to kind of, I've always heard that, but that's an interesting way of kind of clarifying that piece of it.
Yeah. And I think Appomattox, that's why I really appreciate Appomattox Courthouse, is they're really preserving, they're not really pushing one way or the other. They're showing what actually happened and how those ideas slowly formed and got stronger throughout the Civil War. And that is actually what did happen. And so I really appreciated that. I think we already talked about the Confederate, and we talked about Eli Parker a little bit.
Yeah.
He was the Seneca soldier who was there from the American Indian tribe that was there. He had a conversation with Lee.
Yeah, you liked that.
I
piece
liked
of
it because it kind of reminds me a little bit of what Reagan said. A little bit of what the surgeon said with Reagan.
Oh, yeah.
Today, sir, we're all Republicans. Lee, as Eli Parker and Marshall are working out the terms of the surrender, they're writing it.
They're scribing it all out.
They're scribing it out. Lee asks Parker, if he's American Indian. He says, yes, I'm of the Seneca tribe. And he goes, it's good to have one true American here.
Yeah.
And he responds to Lee, sir, we're all Americans. And I just loved that. And we visit where Parker's buried in Buffalo, New York. We visit Red Jacket, who is his chief, and we're at the location. We don't really go to Parker's grave because we didn't know he was right there, but we're standing in that location. Yeah. If you want to see that video from Forest Lawn in Buffalo, New York. But I just thought that was pretty
and
cool.
especially for that time period as well. Like it gives you just a little bit more insight into the mind that was, General Lee, right? Like that's just not a comment that you would expect in that historical setting. And that's maybe just me being uneducated there, but I don't think that sentiment was common back then.
No, and I don't think so either. And I think, again, 4 years of fighting, really of war weariness. What are we fighting for? What are we killing each other for? I think those kind of sentiments are coming through. We talked a little bit about the furniture in the McLean house.
Yeah.
So we visited the Natural History Museum at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., and the chairs from the surrender are there. The chair that Lee sat in, the chair that Grant sat in, are at the Smithsonian in D.C. There's a recreation of those chairs. They look almost identical
Yep.
in the McLean House, the Appomattox Court House, and the table. I think there's a table in Chicago, and there's a table in the actual Appomattox Courthouse, which were the actual tables that were there. Now, when the surrender actually takes place, you get Custer is probably the worst at this. Union soldiers buying furniture or just taking furniture from the McLean House.
Yeah, soldiers being soldiers.
They take the chairs. Custer will take the table and the truce flag, the dish towel that he gets, and people will take the chairs, buy the chairs, and pretty much McLean's house is cleaned out of furniture. Everybody just takes stuff.
That poor guy.
So this is also another reason why he leaves, because now his house has been stripped of furniture and his money's worth nothing. And so he goes back to Alexandria to make a living. The house will go into foreclosure. We talked about this, and then it gets taken apart. But when Custer's killed at the Battle of Little Bighorn, and his wife will go on a campaign to build up his name. That's why we know Custer so well today, because his wife really did a good job of building his interest. She will donate the flag and the table back to the Smithsonian upon her death. So you can see the truce flag in the Smithsonian.
Yep. And then the desk is at
Appomattox Courthouse. So if you want to visit those things, that's where they are.
Yeah, it was a ton of fun. It's easy for kids too, right? If you ever want to bring kids there, we just kind of cut them loose outside. There's stuff you can see behind the McLean House, enslaved quarters, kind of showing your classic, that kind of era, the separated kitchen, separated quarters, and things like that. But other buildings to see, the gift shop was great. They had you could go in and see the prison, right? Where they held certain
behind
folks behind the courthouse. The general store, and all sorts of things to just kind of walk around and do. Great afternoon. There's not much too close to there. So we actually have another video that I made while we were there, kind of tips and tricks of visiting Appomattox Courthouse. So be on the lookout for that to come out on the Walk with History YouTube channel soon. But for those listening, thank you for listening to the Talk with History podcast. And please reach out to us at our website, talkwithhistory.com. But more importantly, if you know someone else that might enjoy this podcast, please share it with them, especially if you think that today's topic would interest a friend. Shoot them a text and tell them to look us up. We rely on you, our community, to grow, and we appreciate you all every day. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.